Every Australian should have a place to call home, a place they can afford, a place they feel secure, a place that gives them shelter, decency and access to everything else that comes with their innate rights as a human being. The sad reality is that the last time we saw a substantial investment in public housing and a long-term commitment to public housing was in 2008 under the Rudd government. I pulled out the member for Sydney's speech in introducing the original National Rental Affordability Scheme bill, and just the challenges that it outlined, some now 11 years on, are just basically exactly the same as what we face today. There are many low and moderate income earners who are stuck in the rental market. We have situations where rent rises, as the member for Sydney said 11 years ago, are outstripping wages and inflation. There is a poor supply of rental properties, and unfortunately, because of the 2014 cap on the National Rental Affordability Scheme by the then Abbott government, we continue to see this problem across our entire country. Now, I personally didn't grow up in public housing, but my parents were, through natural market forces, able to enter the home ownership market by purchasing a house opposite the then still operating Fremantle prison, and that was my first family home. I'd note that when it comes to public housing, the experience in this place, the only person who is in public housing in this chamber is, of course, the Prime Minister. But I think we need to really engage with the experiences of people who rely on these sort of schemes to make sure that they can have enough to pay for everything else. They can have enough to pay for their food, their medical expenses, education and the rest. Now, the good thing about this bill is that it does address investor and tenant concerns with the operation of the National Rental Affordability Scheme. Ensuring that investors receive payments in a timely manner is something that Labor supports. It stops stock being withdrawn from the scheme, which then leads to increases in rent for people who may seek to stay in that particular property. It removes ambiguity in terms of the calculation for below-market rents. I think it is unfortunate when you have that debate between a tenant and a landlord arguing about whether or not something is indeed below market, and this bill will address that. It's a proudly Labor program that we're talking about today. It is, as I said before, one of the largest single investments in affordable housing that we've seen in recent times. Implemented in 2008, the scheme aims to have properties at some 20% below market rates. The scheme initially provided for some 50,000 homes, with a view that in 2012 you'll be able to expand that to another 50,000 homes once the scheme had proved successful. The fact that we're amending the scheme shows that in many ways it has been successful, but it is only one part of that solution of providing affordable housing for Australian families. The slash and burn budget of 2014 did cap the number of dwellings at 38,000. It means that we have fewer affordable properties for low-income families than we should in this country. It was criticised, and I pay tribute to the business groups that actually criticised that decision of the Abbott government. That budget in 2014 had many things that was wrong with it, but it was good to see the increasing realisation of people, including the Property Council and others, who have been active in my electorate in recent days, indeed today, advocating for more public housing. We know that there's a need. What we've seen from the Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute shows that from 2011 to 2016, expenditure from the government on social housing decreased some 7%. We know that the amount of available stock is decreasing, not increasing. Again, the Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute estimates that there is some deficit of 200,000 affordable dwellings across the Australian housing market. In fact, if we wanted to catch up, just to catch up between now and 2026, we would need to be adding an additional 17,000 homes across the nation just to deal with that deficit. So this is an important bill. It makes sure that we get a little bit down that track, but it doesn't really address those big structural challenges we have in terms of making sure that every Australian has somewhere to call home. The sector is not just confined, of course, to the National Rent Affordability Scheme. There's some 812,000 tenants in some 396,000 households in the social housing sector across Australia. But when you look at what those particular houses and those particular households are experiencing, estimates of between 4 and 24% of those dwellings are considered overcrowded. That is, the houses are not appropriate for the people who are living in them. And at the same time, we've got between 7 and 26% of those houses underutilised. That is, there is too much space for the people who are in them. Our social housing system across states and the Commonwealth doesn't work for so many people who are relying on it. And then you get to the people who don't even have access to that system. 2016 census night, the estimation was there were some 9,000 people in Western Australia who were homeless, did not have somewhere to call home, did not have a mortgage, did not have even a lease for a rental property. That night, across the country, some 116,000 Australians did not have somewhere to call home. Most of the anecdotal evidence is that these figures are increasing and increasing. Homelessness is a huge challenge in my electorate of Perth, but it's not just about numbers. Any one person who doesn't have somewhere to call home is a very personal crisis and a very personal tragedy, and it's something that we can do so much more about if we take this issue seriously. Housing is one of the biggest costs that households face. 29% of gross income for most families is spent on housing. That's slowly increasing over time. Some 25 years ago, that was just 21.9%. And I think if we were to survey any of our constituents, people's expectations would be that they're going to be spending more of a larger proportion of their income on housing, not less. And I go back to that challenge of homelessness. In Western Australia, there are 13,953 households on the Western Australian public housing list, waiting for public housing. Now, indeed, they might be in the private rental market paying excessive amounts. They might be staying with family and friends, but also we know a large number of those people who are on that housing wait list are what we would term homeless. In the Perth CBD, the estimates are that there are some 600 people, night to night, sleeping rough in and around the CBD. That's completely unacceptable. I have written to the Leader of the Government in the Senate, given his actions in terms of housing for the Tasmanian Government, saying that it would be the need is probably more pressing in Western Australia than indeed it was in Tasmania. Definitely on a per capita basis it is, but as I said before, any individual who doesn't have access to a home is a personal crisis and a personal tragedy. I would love to see that $343 million debt that the state government is unable to repay to the Commonwealth, unable to repay except on the Commonwealth's own terms, come to an agreement so that we can invest in more social housing in Western Australia. That would be consistent with the outcomes and the goals of this bill. It would also make sure that we have more money for things such as a common ground facility. I know that that's been a huge success in Queensland. I know it's been a huge success in Melbourne. These are facilities that help people with that very difficult transition from homelessness to home. And if you want to have people who are homeless able to access the National Rental Affordability Scheme, there's a step before that. We all know that that is a very complex transition from homelessness into secure, stable housing. And the first step of that is to have those intense wraparound services as provided through the Common Ground model. I would love to see the government invest in one in Western Australia. The former Rudd-Gillard government invested in them across the country. Western Australia at the time was going through a spectacular boom. We did not take up that opportunity. I think in retrospect that was a mistake of the then state government. But now it is an urgent need, and I'd urge members on the government side to look at what they can do to make sure that we invest in housing in Western Australia. Labor is committed and will continue to be committed to investing in housing. We took a plan to the last election to make sure that we continued to this discussion through COAG. I note that the government has, even on their own priorities of the environment and reducing plastics, decided to cancel COAG for the end of the year. We don't know when the next COAG meeting is, but I know that had Labor have been elected, homelessness would have been on the agenda and COAG would have been meeting. We took a plan to build an extra 250,000 new affordable rental homes over 10 years. That would have simply cleared the backlog. It wouldn't have got us further ahead. It would have just got us back to a point where there were almost enough homes for the people who need affordable housing. And we had a commitment, which is something I would encourage again the government to look at, which was an $88 million investment for a safe housing fund to help women and children escaping domestic violence. I know, again, in my electorate of Perth, the services that provide that are constantly oversubscribed, having to move people out of their service often before those families, those children, those women are ready to move into a more normal tenancy arrangement. And anything that we can do in this place that would actually increase investment in those services and allow people to make that transition when they're escaping family violence is something that should be looked at by the government, and indeed I think you'd find much support on this side of the House. I then want to just talk a bit about affordable housing is one part of addressing poverty. This week is Anti-Poverty Week, and these things are all interconnected. You can't have a national rental affordability scheme without acknowledging the other causes and impacts of poverty. We know that there's some 3 million Australians who live below the poverty line. Of those 3 million Australians, 739,000 of them are children. In fact, 1 in 6 children are estimated to live below the poverty line. We know that those on youth allowance are some of the most likely to experience poverty, as are those on New Start. And a report released earlier this week showed that as many as 1 in 5 Australians have experienced food insecurity in the last year. That is, skipping meals. Parents saying that they will choose, have said in this report, that they would choose to not feed themselves so that they can feed their children. I know that the member for Blaxland earlier spoke about the work that Foodbank does. The fact that Foodbank expanded its program in New South Wales for another 500 schools is a sign that something is not working in this country, a sign that things aren't as they should be. We also know that when it comes to secure housing, people pay their rent first. That means that the most tragic thing that can happen is someone to have to go through an eviction. The ongoing costs of dealing with that crisis is serious, and so when rents go up, it reduces funding for food, for health, for schooling and all those other things. If we want to break the cycle of poverty in Australia, we have to be serious about investing in housing. And I just want to put this in a broader context about the need for not just this piece of legislation to go through, but for more action on affordable housing, national action on affordable housing, and put it in the context of Australia's more broader human rights obligations. Housing is a human right. It is one of the most complex to deliver on, because it's not just about a piece of legislation, it's not about just saying we shouldn't discriminate. It is actually about that big piece of coordinated government action to build houses, to provide the economic circumstances in which houses are affordable. But the right to housing is enshrined not just in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it's enshrined in the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. It is a human right. There's some estimate that there's 1 billion people in the world who do not have adequate housing. In fact, there's the best estimates are there are some 100 million people who, by Australia's and international definitions, you would consider homeless. And those numbers, I think, are just so hard to comprehend in terms of what that means, in terms of the lost economic potential of our community and our global family, that if there is 100 million people who are homeless, they're not making a serious contribution, they're not able to make the sorts of decisions that we all take for granted in this place. I also note that when you look at where we enshrine housing as a human right, we enshrine it as a human right in the Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. We include it in the Declaration of Rights of the Child. We include it in the ILO's conventions. And we include it in the housing rights of Indigenous peoples. housing is something that we should take more action on, but I do support the bill.